Open the meeting at 6:36. Montpelier-Roxbury Board of School Directors. And the first order of business is public comment. This is where we receive input from the public on whatever topic the public wants to bring to our attention. It's a listening time for us. That doesn't mean we're not registering what we're hearing, and it's not informing our decision making later. But we don't respond in real time. It's not a question and answer or interactive sessions. And just for the record, we are having a budget presentation. We're having a second public comment after that budget presentation. So if you have questions about the budget and want to wait until then, or if you want to speak both times, please feel free. So that said, anyone in the room for public comment, and then we'll go to, we've got 3 people. Whoever wants to go first, or if you want to present as a group, if that's what you're thinking, whichever works best.
We also have handout.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Scott, how's the audio now? Hold on, Joe, 1 second. Just got a note from Scott online that the audio isn't working great. Oh, Anna says it's fine.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Joe Carroll, the president of the MREA and I'm a Latin teacher at the high school. Thank you for your careful consideration of the budget so far this year, especially given the context of how tough it is for us and for our colleagues across the state. I also appreciate the focus that y'all have done on level funding and making sure that our students have access to the same programming that they've had in the past. But I did want to point your attention to a specific part of the budget presentation tonight that refers to a 0.8 reduction in the world language department here at the high school. And while I know, and we can all agree that reasonable people can disagree on how many classes or sections of class there should be at a small high school like ours, I think reasonable people can also disagree on the merits of finding an opportunity to save money by a position's anticipated vacancy. And I know that's a tough work that you all have as part of the school board. I do want to bring to your attention, though, that the 0.8 position in world language was the result of student demand. These are students who want to access French and Spanish and Latin, and we think that cutting the 0.8 would limit what our department can offer for the students in the future. We also think that this would adversely impact the entry points, our level 1s, and the advanced sections that we offer, which is a tough pill to swallow. My colleagues, Colleen and Bridget, will talk a little bit more specifically about that after I'm off. And so I just want to close by saying that we've seen some mention of class size policy when we discuss this. And we think that cutting this 0.8 position would increase class sizes for sure, but it would also counterintuitively decrease sections, and therefore we think access points to world language. And basically what I mean by that is you have less access to language courses, so students would be deprived of the opportunities to take a language if there's less sections. Scheduling is far less restrictive when there are 2 or more sections of the class. And so to close, we recognize that students cannot take whatever they want, whenever they want it. There are definitely trade-offs in a small school like ours, but we think that this trade-off comes at too high of a price for our language students. So we feel that it's in the best interest of our students and our community to maintain the access points we have and not limit kids from taking these classes just because coincidentally a vacancy is occurring during a tough budget season. So I thank you for your consideration and have a good meeting.
Thank you.
Colleen, when you talk, can you move the mic a little bit closer to your mouth? There you go. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Colleen Purcell. I'm a Spanish teacher here at Montpelier High School. I've been teaching in Montpelier for 13 years. And I would like to this time just to explain kind of the details of how this 0.8 FTE cut would impact the Spanish program and opportunities for students in Spanish at Montpelier. So to give a little bit perspective for that, right now we offer 5 levels of Spanish. There's 1 through 18, which is level 5. And we offer a cooking class that is somewhat unique in that it's a bilingual class. So some students take it as an elective to learn about culture and cooking, and some take it for that plus as an elective Spanish. If we were to cut 0.8 FTE, what that would mean in Spanish classes is that we wouldn't offer that cooking class. We would also not be able to offer one of our 2 sections of Spanish 3. Currently, there are 48 students in Spanish 2, and just given our average attrition rate, many more than what would fit in one section would be requesting to take Spanish next year. And so we have to tell some students that they couldn't take Spanish next year, which would mean that they, kind of in effect, couldn't continue their Spanish studies. I say that only because if anybody's ever studied a foreign language, you know that when you take a year off of practice, we lose a lot of skill. And so entering back in at that next level would be very difficult. Not impossible, but I've seen it happen for students that from the lab. In addition to that, and this is where it kind of gets difficult for me to wrap my head around, we still would have to cut another section of Spanish. And because Spanish is a language that's sequential, we have to choose from one end or the other. So the option would be a Spanish 1 class, the Spanish 1 class, or the AP Spanish class. If we were to cut, let's just go the route of Spanish 1, that would mean that we would not offer a way into studying Spanish for students who, for various reasons, have not had success or had the opportunity to study Spanish before coming to Montpelier High School. It would also mean that here at Montpelier High School, the only way for students to start studying a new language would be to study Latin, which is not to say anything bad about Latin, but just I think that that lack of opportunity doesn't reflect any values that we have here at Montpelier High School. So given that, if instead we say, no, we want to keep Spanish 1, then the other option is to cut AP Spanish, which would mean that for students who have invested 5 to 6 years of their academic time here studying Spanish, they would have to be told, basically their senior year, that they can't continue their studies, that class isn't available for them. And I think for me, I did just hit home when I was teaching my Spanish 4 class yesterday, and looking at those students, and they're so engaged, and their skills in Spanish have grown so much, and to think that next year they won't have an opportunity to continue that is really difficult for me. And I guess I understand the immense challenge that you all are facing on the board to try and find a budget that's appropriate. And I understand the reasoning behind choosing or considering a position that doesn't have an individual stake potentially behind it. I just hope that these details help to see the faces of the students. There are individual students that I can picture that this would impact, as well as the broader impact on the program and the opportunities offered. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your service to the community.
Thanks, Colleen.
You're good.
I'm going to go up. I think French and Spanish skills. First, I just want to
Or at least I thought you were. Apparently you weren't.
I want to echo what Colleen and Vera talked about, and all the factors that Colleen has mentioned for Spanish is also true with French in terms of the potential cuts to our program. And I want to point out, briefly, some of my students were currently in my Spanish 1 class, a section that we may not be able to consider the first class. In this class, I have students who transferred from other students, some who came from different countries, some accessing special education, some taking language for the first time, some who were previously homeschooled. And it's a lovely class. It really starting to think that you limit access to Spanish in the future, potentially the same way that we currently limit access to French and the definition of it. I also want to point to another potential effect of this proposed cut. As Colleen mentioned, 11 tech and FSM and IT classes that we offer in the world language department. And I want to talk about 11 tech. They're offered on alternating years, and they're both innovative, inclusive classes that were born out of student interest and also serve as a real students. Want to talk about urban tech because the one I know best, that's an interdisciplinary class that combines entrepreneurship, cooking, food system, education, and also dog training, cooking type stuff, farmers market. In addition to the curricular goals, urban tech also fundraisers for travel scholarships. We've helped support over 30 students exchanges through youth-based scholarships. And we were currently looking ahead at a French and Spanish exchange program centered around these guaranteed funds for all families. For many students, these unique experiential learning opportunities are a core part of their education here, and I hope you consider the unintended effects. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Anyone else in the room? No, it looks like we have one person online, and again, please introduce yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great. This is Kara Rosenberg. I'm going to echo what Joe and Colleen and Brigitte just said, certainly about being very thankful for all of the thoughtful budget work. I know that this is really difficult for school boards at this point. I think I would love to offer a parent perspective on the proposed French cut. I think that one of the things that I'd really like the board to consider is being really careful about not doing something that's going to reduce offerings that will then drive students and families to look elsewhere, especially when they're seniors. I think that, I'm not a parent who has been very encouraging of early college. That today I had the first conversation of, well, what if there's no French 5? What if there aren't those offerings for me when I get to a senior to do what I think Montpelier High School has always done, which is offer a really challenging, rigorous program of study. And it's really worrying to me if we start to get to the point where like senior year gets chipped away at, because I think that those things like driving what will happen then is then if students start making choices which end up sending their dollars to early college, that's then more money that's then going away from our school system. And so that's one thing that I would really encourage you to think about. I also want to echo what Brigitte was talking about in terms of some of the French electives, which I know best in preserving, the dynamic programming, the exciting things that are happening at Montpelier. And I think there's a lot of great stuff happening. I know Asa has had a wonderful experience thus far. And as I'm doing that, I have not read all of the budget information. I'm sure the arts come up as they always do. And I just want to take this opportunity to say how much I support, and I know a lot of community members support the music program at MHS. I think it is one of the most dynamic programs that's happening. I think that Allie and Sadie, certainly at the high school level, have done an amazing job at bringing back programs that really were decimated through COVID. And certainly at U32, where I work, we see this a lot, like what really happened to the music programs over COVID. And both of my kids are really excited to do music all the time and are really excited by what's being offered there. And so I encourage you to think about that as you're planning for your budget. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else online?
I don't see anybody else.
Great. No, thank you. Again, we will have a second public comment period after the budget presentation. Next order of business is the consent agenda. This is where we approve a variety of kind of just pro forma business, so we don't have to take the time to individually discuss them. If there's an item that a board member feels needs further clarification or discussion, that can be pulled from the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
May I ask, point of order, do we have to add something to the consent agenda from
Do we?
the announced tuition item, or is that its own item? I think that's its own item.
On the consent.
Okay,
You see it?
So,
now I do. Okay, apologies. I move we approve the consent agenda.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion, questions? All's in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent agenda passes. Two potential board actions. One is, one in particular is very exciting, but we'll start with potential motion to vote on and dissolve the transition committee.
Rhett, you wanna?
What, do you want to either make that motion or explain the?
I move to dissolve the Roxbury Transition Committee and then hope to speak about some of the accomplishments of that group in discussion.
Yeah. Do I have a second?
Second.
Discussion?
So the Roxbury Transition Committee formed before the 5-year implementation of the new weighting system came in, before we knew that the budget was going to be skyrocketing to 23%. We didn't know that the budget would fail at that time. We thought that we would be looking at sort of the pros and cons of keeping the school. By the time the committee got sort of in motion, that had all changed, and basically the wheels had started turning. The budget, I think, had failed, and it was pretty clear that many folks in Montpelier had feelings about keeping our little school in Roxbury. I don't want to speak to all the emotional stuff, but the transition committee ended up focusing on improving transportation from Roxbury and an after-school program. And so we were ultimately able to make recommendations, or sort of work with Libby to make recommendations to have 2 buses coming out of Roxbury. There's an East Roxbury bus that goes up 12, and then there's a Roxbury Village bus. A lot of kids get on at the school for the Roxbury Village bus, and their transportation time is about 35 minutes. So that's great. There was a lot of fear of really long transportation times. Busing is still hard. It still happens in the winter, and it's, K through 12. I don't know how many seniors are on the bus, but there's a wide range of ages. There is a bus monitor when things are right, as I understand it. And that's all been a success. The Roxbury after-school program, the Bridges program, is a 3-day program, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at RVS. And that's been extremely successful and really, really well received by folks in Roxbury. The kids get together at their little school, which I think means a lot. They're with staff who they had been working with in previous years for a number of years. It's open to homeschool families, and there are a few families that chose to homeschool rather than having their kids come to Montpelier. And so there are maybe, in my view, the after-school program right now is more inclusive than the school ever was, because there's such a wide range of homeschoolers there. The programming is excellent. We're starting a ski program at Bolton. I'm excited to be there for that. I was there last year. It was awesome. A lot of kids getting on a ski chairlift for the first time in their lives is pretty special. So those are the main accomplishments of the Roxbury Transition Committee. There's one other accomplishment that was sort of incidental to the makeup, which I think was also really interesting and helpful. There were parents, there were teachers, there were administrators, and there were board members. And that allowed a lot of dialogue with a lot of different groups in a setting that could be counted upon, not the formal public comment of our board meetings, which doesn't allow for dialogue, essentially. That dialogue was really productive. It was really helpful. I think there was some healing that happened with that dialogue. And Lynn and myself and Scott feel like that model might be something that the board might utilize if other really big out of the norm things happen. Say the high school floods, or I have no idea, any kind of catastrophe. That model was really nice. It was really nice to have people communicating across those. I think there were community members without kids in the schools as well. So we want to recommend to the board that everyone keeps that model in mind in case there's some kind of, drastic changing of school funding, or, flood or fire or earthquake or any of the other things that can happen. Yes, pandemics. And then ultimately, the board decided to offer the building back to the select board in Roxbury. The select board has put 3 options forward for a floor vote at town meeting day in Roxbury. Essentially, one is to consolidate the municipal buildings there. One is to not accept the building. And then one is in line with the presentations that were made to the board that include the private school in Roxbury utilizing some of the space and looking for other revenue sources for that space. So we'll see how that goes for Roxbury, but I think the outcome is what the outcome is, and that model is potentially something that might be useful to us if we run into a wall or a hole or something like that.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Brett. And I also just, for further discussion, I want to thank you and Lynn and Scott and all the community members who served on that, as well as the members from the faculty and staff here, district-wide. A lot of great work was done, and it was a tough issue, and a lot was thrown on you. And I know definitely a lot of tough emotions, but I also want to acknowledge that the kind of the great work and just making sure the kids were very welcome. And it seems like so far this year there's been it's been a very welcoming environment for all kids at UES, and I think that transition committee was part of it. Any other comments or discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? So motion passes, and again, we will keep the model in mind for future events. And then finally, we have a wonderful applicant who is willing to step into the second Roxbury seat on the board. Casey is Capin. Do you want to come up and introduce yourself? And I just want to say, normally we have executive session before we appoint. I'm not sure it's necessary tonight, but if people want to go into the executive session, we can do that. But I think we can also probably skip it as well.
I'm Casey Capin. You have all seen my letter and have some perspective on why I'm stepping into this role at this time. I do have the intention of putting my name forward for the county election as well, and continuing this beyond just the next 3 months. But I've lived in Roxbury for the past 11 years. I've got 2 kiddos, both at UES in 2nd through 4th grade. And although I haven't necessarily been sitting at the table, I've been observing over the last couple of years when we've been board meetings. And am honored to be being considered for them. So I think I'll come to some very difficult decisions, with thoughtful, deliberative process, and I have a lot of respect for the work that you developed. So I look forward to the opportunity of joining you and this conversation.
Excellent, thank you. And you already addressed one thing I was going to bring up with you, was the fact that your appointment will be short, and then I have to go to the voters. And just I think I told you this in email, but I think the signature deadline is sometime at the end of this month, perhaps. Yeah.
25th.
Yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, questions for Kathy? Or Casey, sorry.
What you- What's your day job? And
I work for the state of Vermont. I'm in the Department of Environmental Conservation Site Management section. So
Good, we don't have representation from that section yet. We have one from many others, but.
I know you talked about PCB, but.
Yeah, great, great.
Right up our alley.
Fantastic.
I do mostly super fun work.
It's kind of an issue when we did the UES playground.
Yeah.
Other questions for Casey? No. I would definitely entertain a motion to appoint her.
I move we appoint Casey Cathan to the second position of Roxbury representative to the Board of School Directors.
Do I have a second?
a second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You are,
Thank you.
you cannot
Thank
vote until you get sworn in, but you're certainly welcome to either stay in the audience or if you want to pull up a chair and join us here, whichever.
Thank
You are.
Yeah.
And just as a reminder, it looks like Rhett, you need those, or you need to
Yeah.
one up. Jake, you do too. And Tim,
I think just one last year.
There are a bunch of elections.
and that looks like it.
How many years is each of us to put on the form? Two, or
I mean-
some are two, some are three?
Everyone is, a full term is 3. I think Tim, if he chooses to run again, is running for a partial term unless he wants to wrestle Jake for the full term. There's a split term in Montpelier. It's the remainder of, unless are you
Yeah.
at the, are you at the end of, like when we appointed you were at the end of, oh,
I thought I ran for a 1-year term last year.
okay, that's right.
I think.
Yeah, I thought we appointed you, but you ran, so it will be, yeah, so it's 2 full terms. Okay, all 3. I thought you were mid-session, but you're not. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so it's a full term is 3, so, and I know, Rhett, you definitely have not been appointed into a, been here for the long haul, so, yeah. No, I was confused on Tim, but you're definitely full term and it sounds like Tim is too, so 3 years.
No need to wrestle.
Anna has sent me school board membership documentation just in case anybody wants it because she's that good.
Thank you again, Anna.
Okay.
Budget.
All right. Let me share it. Okay, so some of these slides, I'm sorry, some of these slides you've seen before. Just as a reminder to always put them in front of our community members. Tonight, very similar things. We have shortened this presentation though from what it has been before, and I'll run through the beginning pretty quickly. Could you collapse the pictures on the screen?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, better. Okay. So just a reminder of the board's focus is academic achievement for all students, safety, inclusion, and belonging for every member of our community, and a commitment to open communication with our community. Just a whole list of resources in case anybody has not seen any of these just yet. And a reminder, just because I think it's really important that that the school board is voting on our particular budget. However, the way education finance, it's one system in the state and we're all putting money into a big big basket and that everybody gets whatever they ask for. So other districts do impact our tax rates as well. And again, you've seen this before, just recommended priorities. We want to maintain resources for effective MTSS model and SEL and academics. We want to abide by the MRPS class size policy and the EQS, as well as research-backed guidelines for staffing levels, allow for professional learning and equitable and inclusive classroom instruction. We want to sustain our safe facilities. We want to ensure continuation of our co-curricular activities and develop a budget that's fiscally responsible for our taxpayers. And finally, these are in no order of importance. However, I find this one very important: protect the services dedicated to our most vulnerable children and families. We know more now than we did 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whenever we had our last budget meeting. With the vacation, it seems forever. We have version 3 of our long-term weighted ADM, which may be the final version. Looking at Christina, she might know, she says no. So we're not sure if that's going to be one more version of long-term weighted ADM. We have an estimate of the dollar yield, but a reminder that that dollar yield is not set until it is set into law in late May, early June. We do know our cent discount. We know our CLA, which has changed in this budget round, which we'll get to. From the revenue side, we're still not aware of our EEE grant, but we know our transportation aid, and the board has given us indications of what we want to put into the budget. However, that's still up for discussion for the board. From our fund balance. We don't know in terms of expenses. We're still in negotiations with both our teachers union, which is the MREA, and our instructional assistants union, which is the MRESSA. We are currently in contract negotiations with them. And we do know our Career Center 6th semester average at this point. So there's a lot more knowns now than there were the last time that we all met. Christina, take it away.
In this draft, the education spending is set at 7.74%. This is a 0.25% decrease from the previous draft. The equalized pupils also decreased by 2.81. And earlier today, I found out they're going to further decrease by 1.32. That's not version 4. It's kind of a version 3.1. So we're just waiting for all superintendents in the state to certify the data, which is a new process this year. So we have about 10 districts statewide that have not certified, and then we'll get version 4 and hopefully the final version. There has been no adjustment to the yield and a small increase to the CLA. We received those letters from the state last week. With these factors in place, Montpelier would see a decrease in their tax rate of 3.01%, and Roxbury will see a decrease of 6.02%. That's a decrease in the tax rate from the current year. Next slide. We can actually skip right to the next slide. I'm just going to talk about the changes in the budget from the previous draft. The 2 programs that have changed since the last time I met with you and presented a draft are general education, and this is where you'll see the reduced FTE, the 0.8 that was referenced earlier in the meeting. And the second change is under student support. Our community liaison, we increased to a full year position. Excuse me. Those are the only 2 changes. The next slide is just a different way of looking at our expenses. So here you can see the salaries, benefits, professional services. The next slide. For the revenues, the decrease in the expenditures decreased the amount we needed for the education spending grant. So the top line is the only line that changed here, and it decreased. And the next slide is the long anticipated slide. What does this all mean for our taxpayers? So here we demonstrate what the property tax bill could look like if everything stays the way it is now. And those are the decreases that residents would see. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm kind of moving a little fast, so. The next slide, the only change here, the CLA went up just a little bit. went from 127% to 0.72. So this is second homes and businesses. Nothing's changed on the capital plan. I just wanted to include it because there was some discussion at the last board meeting about what we're contributing to that.
Do Christina did talk to our lawyer to find out if the capital plan needs to be a separate warning like we've done in the past. And it does not. We found out that it does not have to be a separate warning. So,
Yeah, so that article will come off your warning.
and yet still included though in the budget as of right now.
Right, it's still included in your expenses. That's why it doesn't make sense to keep it as a separate article. So it's already built into your expenses, just like your transfer to the food service fund. And the next slide is the fund balance. We've maintained a $400,000 transfer from the fund balance. In the next exercise where we use the interactive chart, I can demonstrate how reducing or increasing that transfer affects your tax rates.
Hold please. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it while I'm pulling this up.
On the capital plan, we planning in FY 26 to replace a lot of windows at UES and MS.
I think that's a conversation that we want to have with the board, particularly the facilities committee.
Okay.
Yes, that is the plan. The question is, how do we do it financially? What's the best way to do it? $270,000 is not going to replace the windows. So we want to talk with the finance and the facilities committee. I think Tim's got this on his mind as well, of what's the best way financially to do that the board wants to go for. So I think it's worth further discussion.
Okay. Because it kind of looks like the next 3 years is all windows all the time and all the money is for windows.
Yes. So it doesn't have to be that way. So it could go that way, or it could go other ways that may or may not be prudent. So we just want to have a conversation around it. You could decide, for instance, to go out to bond and do it all at one time. You know, there's worthwhile conversations to be had about what is the best way to get a major project like that done.
And the capital plan is for like planned projects and like emergency things come out of a different source.
Typically, yeah, we did make an emergency decision with the roof here at MHS this past summer because it was leaking in the cafeteria. That came out of the capital plan, which is where the money went. But it's definitely worth further discussion, I think, beyond this budget, but it's worth further discussion for the board.
Okay, thank you.
Jake, were you asking because you would think we would want to put more money into the capital plan in our budget? Because that would be an impact to our budget. Or do you think we should leave it at 270, which is what is currently in there?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
We did talk about it in facilities committee a little bit. And, you know, it was scary, the cost of each of those huge windows. But also I remember like the mechanical functioning of the windows of the middle school is really, really bad. So those are pretty high priority. So I think we should talk about it more.
Thorough conversation about where we're going with repairs and maintenance and all of that stuff.
I think I heard the concept of bond vote to do more at once. Is that logistically doable? Because
It's logistically doable. It's whether the taxpayers want to do it, want to do. That's part of the logistics. That's the harder part.
Like a contractor could do more windows.
Yeah.
It's not, it could be done in like a summer.
Right.
If you wanted to spend that much money without interrupting teachers' ability to get in the classrooms and prepare for the school year, and could be done quickly.
That is one way to think about it. Yeah.
This budget, I think the issue is whether, any funds that are currently in the budget might want to go into capital. And we talked last time, and I was interested in the exercise, Christina, that you have pulling the fund balance transfer out the $400,000 and putting that towards the capital plan, because the capital balance at the end of this year is pretty much nothing. And so just thinking, if we have another roof issue and need some funds and that this year may not be a year we need to buy down the tax rate with that fund balance, it may be prudent to sort of wean ourselves off that practice and move that $400,000 into the capital fund. So that would impact this budget. And I guess Christine can tell you how.
All right, put up.
For one of this first demonstrate adding an additional 400,000 to the capital plan. First exercise I hear. That would change. Oh, we're on different one.
Nope.
Nope, there
It
it
just
is.
took a second.
Oh, okay. All right, so in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see Montpelier's tax rate would still decrease by 1.49%. Roxbury would decrease by 4.53%.
But that's with, just to be clear, there's still the $400,000 surplus addition to a revenue source. Like you didn't take 400,000 out of that.
Yeah, so for simplicity, I just added it to the
Yeah.
capital plan instead of decreasing it from the non-tax revenues, but that's
Right.
just math. At this point, though, let me just demonstrate what would happen if the yield, we stuck to that plan and the yield dropped. Any suggestions out there?
500.
500.
500, Alex.
Hey, Christina, on the 400,000, I feel like I should know this, but I don't. But would that affect the budget that we're about to warn? Like, it doesn't, it's sort of aside from that.
So there's two ways to look at it. You have your fund balance. You can make a motion to just transfer it into the capital plan, but here it's built into your expenses as a revenue and an expenditure because it's coming from your fund balance as a revenue.
It's an offsetting revenue right now.
Yes, yep.
So
So
like
it doesn't technically affect your tax rate.
our tax rate,
From
it would,
the other.
If it's an offsetting revenue, so you have that money in the bank.
Yeah.
And then you're just moving it to your capital fund, which is a separate fund.
yeah, the reason I ask is because like, the budget, the top line number we could warn but then depending on how things go in the ed fund, we may decide to do one thing or another with the $400,000 of fund balance.
Yeah, well, let me show you. I just decreased the property yield, dollar yield by $500. And your tax rate just jumped up to 5% and 1.8% in Roxbury.
And that's with another $400,000 on the capital plan.
Yeah, let me remove that just so you can see what's happening. This still has the $400,000 of fund balance transfer into your general fund.
About that is whatever the dollar yield ends up being, it's about 1.5%.
for every $500.
For the 400,000. We're in the way. That's the difference. From having 400,000 without.
Yeah.
And I would just remind the board, and I know you know this, but I just would remind the board that should the board want to move money from the fund balance into the capital plan, you can do that. You know, you don't, that doesn't need to be part of the budget discussion. You all can do that at any board meeting with a motion. And you can take action on what to use your fund balance for outside of the budgetary process.
Christina, can you remind us, for the FY 25 budget, we planned on using $400,000 of the capital fund, is that correct? But then we
The
didn't
fund
use
balance.
all of it. Sorry, thank you, the fund balance,
So for fiscal year
25, sorry,
Five.
24,
24.
the one that has already ended, not the one that we're in. So 24.
So we budgeted 400,000 and I think we ended up using 241,000.
Okay.
But then for 25, we started at 400 and we increased it to something or other.
Six,
Maybe.
475.
But let
We
me,
talked about six.
We did talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
let me just double check on that one. My network's really slow right now. Okay.
All right.
I think, while Christina's doing that, the ed fund, it gets property tax revenue, but it also gets other revenue sources. And they're not doing so well. Through the first half of FY 25, they're down $8 million. And so that means that the fund is going to get a downgrade for FY 25, probably of around 16 million, because half the year we're down 8 million. And then that also means that next year, FY 26 is probably going to be a downgrade of something. So I think that things in the ed fund are going to, not be as rosy as they look right now, like meaning the yield is going to go down by something
This year.
this year. Yeah, as the legislative session goes on.
I have the number. So for the current year, there's 475,000 budgeted.
And we don't know until the end of this year how much we actually will use
That's
of that?
correct. Yep.
Okay.
So just to reiterate what Jake said, our expert in the room, that we can anticipate that dollar yield decreasing for FY 26. And we may or may not know that before the board is warned a budget.
And Jake, what would be is 500 a reasonable estimate, or just kind of throwing stuff at a wall?
I think it's kind of reasonable. In the commissioner's letter, there was like a 5.9% average bill increase. But if you just look at how those non-property sources are performing, and you did a downgrade for FY 25 and FY 26 of 16 in each year, that would be about a 7.9% average bill increase. So just that by itself is 2%. And on our tables, we were at, I don't remember what the orange column was a minute ago, but
Here.
anyway, I think that 500 is a good number to plug in for a decrease on the yield.
From where it is right now.
Yeah, from the letter with 85.53 or whatever it was.
Yes. Okay. Okay, and that's what you have in right now is a decrease from what we currently know,
Yeah.
of $500.
Yeah.
So 8,053 instead of 8,553. Okay.
Just worse, I mean, a worse case, or I can't say worst case, a worser case, a badder case scenario if it decreased by 1,000. So can you decrease the yield by another 500 just so the board can see what happens without us touching anything else? Then all of a sudden over, like without doing anything, just in case it drops that far, Montpelier's tax rate would be a 10.72% increase and a 7.29% increase in Roxbury. And so that's simply from the dollar yield with no other difference here. And just to remind, the board already knows this, and I know most members of the community knows this, but the board has no control over the dollar yield. So that's just, I just feel like I need to say that over and over again.
And the, you were saying our equalized pupils, that's not final. Will we know that by January 22nd?
I
Probably.
think so.
Yeah. But-
We're a little more certain that that number is near where it's gonna land.
Yeah, in the last two versions, Montpelier hasn't changed much, so.
And
So-
that one doesn't really impact.
So Christina, can you add the 500 back into the dollar yield?
Add the 1,000 or the
Just another 500. Let's just assume that it's going to drop 500. And then can you drop our LTW ADM by, I don't know, 5 students? Just so the board can see what that impact is.
Yeah, it's not that.
It's
big of a deal.
minimal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fact our LTW ATM is pretty good to go, I'd say, because there's such minimal change on our taxes. With the numbers we're talking about for our changes in other districts, it may be different, but for our district, it's nominal. It's the dollar yield. That's the major concern.
Since we had public comment on this, I had 2 questions about the 0.8 FTE. Do you have an idea of how much that is as far as a dollar figure? And also, am I understanding correctly that we did not have that position filled for this school year?
No, we did have it
Oh,
filled
we
for this,
did. Okay.
this school year.
It must be about $80,000, right?
Yeah, she's getting the exact number.
Does the class size policy apply to foreign languages?
Yeah.
Is this the first version of the budget where we're seeing the RIF?
Yeah.
This is, yeah, it wasn't before. Okay. What motivated it?
So the board, we had a discussion and I believe our last meeting regarding potential RIFs and stating that we value our employees quite dearly in this community, on the board and every other factor of our district. And if we could use attrition with our class size policy, we would consider that when it happened. So this is that opportunity. The average class size policy, or the average class size for our world language classes here at MHS across all of them, right? So it's an average, keep that in mind, is 13.6. And the low for our class size policy is 18. So we're quite below that.
I see.
The average in our class size policy is 22 kids per class. So our world language department, as you all saw in public comment tonight, are wonderful individuals and very good at their jobs. And quite rightly are stating why it's so important. And it's not the world language piece particularly, it's the attrition piece. That it's not influencing a person and still abiding by our class size policy.
And you said right now, the average across all world language is 13.6
Yes.
students per class?
That's every world language class. So they're very different classes in there.
Right,
So
right.
it's important
That's
to
true.
note.
Is there a different class size policy for world languages versus like math or ELA or anything like that?
Yeah, your class size policy, it doesn't specifically say world language is different, but for instance, English is different. Written composition, I believe, is what don't quote me on that, but it's something around written composition is different. Music is different, band, PE, there are different class size policies, but the world language fits in the same boat as math. I believe the sciences, other content areas like that.
Just speaking for myself, I'd like to not have that on the table until we have a little bit more information, because it does sound like it directly impacts student experience here. I'm a little biased because I have one of those kids who would be taking another world language next year, and it'd be a real shame to interrupt that flow. I know we have these challenges, and I'm not saying it won't have to come back on, but when we see that even if the dollar yield goes down 500, the tax rates are going up 3%. We had to close an entire elementary school last year, and that was really hard. So I'd love to not cut classroom specific experiences if possible, speaking for myself.
I think the math is kind of interesting because with world languages, you have some group of kids who take these core classes, but then for world languages, they have options. So you're spreading that same group into, out into buckets. So I'm wondering if it makes sense to have the exact same class size policy for things like that.
It's a good question for our policy committee to undertake.
And how many languages are offered at the high school?
Right now, we have 3: Latin, French, and Spanish.
Okay, thanks.
The savings on the position is roughly 87,000.
And then, just so we can see the math, if you put the 87,000 back into the general budget, what does that do? I'm guessing not a whole lot, if 400,000 was 1.5% on the tax rate. So it went up like 0.35. In what?
Miriam, can you talk into the mic so everybody can hear you?
Or it can come up, come a little closer to.
I just like to second what Jill said. I think that especially seeing this very clear and say well-designed handout, that just for such a small difference in the budget, it would make a really big difference in a program that, in my experience, can make a really big difference in students' school experiences. Languages are one of the classes that a lot of different students come together to take. And I think that it's a really important skill that people graduate high school with. Learning a different language, I think we can all agree, helps broaden people's horizons and helps them to see the world in a different way and think about the experiences of other people in a different way than any other program that we offer at these schools too. And I just think for a small reduction, this is going to have a really big impact on a lot of students' access to these programs.
I mean, I have to admit, I'm a little hesitant to put it back in, as much as I appreciate all that and definitely appreciate the great work of the teachers. And the program. I mean, both my kids are in it and have benefited from it hugely. I think anytime you're reducing numbers, you're arguably reducing options. I think that argument is always going to be there and it's always going to be compelling. If we are really going to use attrition as a way to reduce costs, and we can do it in a way that's strategic, if we put that back in next year from the same position, it's going to be a face. It's going to be a person. It's going to be a person depending on that for their family. If the administration thinks we can continue to, meet the needs of students with taking advantage of the attrition, part of being in a tough budget situation is making tough choices and being disciplined about that. And I think we should be careful about, when we have an opportunity that our administration identifies, kind of by the criteria that we ask them to identify it by, unless there's really compelling reasons to not do so, to not be disciplined about that, because, as we had last year, it was a lot harder to do something like Roxbury quickly than to, be a little more strategic and long-term and how we cut costs. Because again, if we're in a tough situation next year, that 0.8 is going to be someone who's using that paycheck for their family. It's going to be a tougher choice.
Well, to be clear, that 0.8 FTE is a person who I see around the school all the time and does excellent work teaching people French and Spanish languages.
My understanding is it's a vacancy that
Will be a vacancy.
there'll be a
next year.
vacancy next year.
I think it's an important specification.
I also would like to echo what Miriam and Jill and all of our wonderful language teachers have said. I think a bigger thing that they might not have mentioned was in this well-organized table here, with this 0.8 FTE, it would mean that colleges like to see 3, usually 4 consecutive years of a language, and that would be difficult if the student's only choice was to come in and take Latin 1 their first year if they didn't have any prior language in middle school. And if the Spanish 1 is cut, it makes it hard for students who have different choices in middle school and have other classes that they have to take and don't have the same opportunities. And as someone who has taken multiple languages at this school for almost 4 years, I've loved every minute of it. And I was lucky enough to have the La Cocina option this year because I completed AP Spanish last year. And without that option, I couldn't have completed 4 years of Spanish at this high school. And I really hope that we can, like Jill said, consider other possibilities before we put this into the budget, because despite what Jim is saying, this does have a big impact on not just the teachers, but the students who rely on languages and connecting with other peers that they don't necessarily have in their core class.
I guess where I would push back on what you're saying, Jim, is I don't see this as strategic because it's $87,000. Is that correct?
Roughly.
Okay, roughly $87,000.
Close enough.
Who knows? My main takeaway from all these budget presentations is, do we know? But for $87,000, there's just going to be such a big change in this language program. And if we're really talking about prioritizing our most vulnerable and underserved students and trying to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities when they graduate from this high school and can go anywhere in their life that they choose to go, languages are really important. They might not seem that way. But like Amani was saying, if students choose to go to higher education, those schools really prioritize seeing languages. And it's going to be very difficult for students who come in from a different middle school, students who are homeschooled, like my French teacher, Brigitte Savard, was talking about earlier, to access these programs and to get those years of language that are going to help them get into college. And for students who are not college bound, these classes are really just as important. They're helping those students see the world in a different way. I think that is a very large impact for $87,000. I understand the need of our taxpayers to keep these tax rates low, but I don't see this as strategic. I see it as a really, really big impact on our students' experience for a relatively small amount of money.
I think the point here is that the board has talked about trying to find ways to save money for taxpayers. And one of the ways that we've agreed is a reasonable way to do that is by looking at natural attrition and what that can mean to the budget in the future. We have a lot of people in the community that are they're telling us they're being taxed out of their homes. And when we have opportunities to find savings through natural attrition, that's what the board has talked about doing. Negotiations occur with our unions. Unions want raises. If budgets fail, then that means a lot more than 0.8 FTE through attrition. If the teachers want raises, that means more taxes for our constituents. And if budgets fail, then the only way to make cuts is by dramatic cuts of real people that everybody's loving all the time that are here. This is not that.
Yeah, I mean, we're just in a tough position where like, every position is valuable and every position gives more options and all the subjects are important. I mean, it's important that students have as many options as possible in math and science and English, and every person we add is more options in every subject. I mean, my feeling is we have to trust the administrators that they can give the students the choices they need with the staffing they're recommending. Yeah, I mean, I don't like to eliminate options, but we do have, yeah, we have a population that's paying a lot, and you know, I'm sure if there was a cut in another program for attrition and the administration thought it made sense, we would be hearing from that department some very similar things. And I think it's a bad habit for the board to get into, to let that drive our decisions.
So I'm the director of property tax in my day job, so I'm very well aware of the pressures on spending and property taxes, probably as much as anyone. My point was just simply based on what I saw tonight, I don't see that. I understand it's something we'd have to keep in consideration, but it doesn't feel like something we should commit to, because what I've seen here is sort of our worst case scenario is a 3% increase. I'm not seeing that we're at the point that we should be cutting direct instruction yet. That was my point. We were pushed really hard last year, and even so, this budget still went down, and we still closed a school. And I think one of our other values was to try not to impact direct instruction for students. That's why I asked the question, because I didn't understand how a vacant 0.8 was going to impact the schedule in the point that it would actually lose entire courses. I think I understand that now, but I don't feel like we're backed into the point tonight that particular component needs to be formalized this evening. It very well might have to come back on the table in the next meeting if we get more information about, well, we still wouldn't have the yield. I mean, I hope that I've proven over the years of the board, I definitely do not question the administration's position. And yes, I was heavily influenced by my daughter's experience and the fact that she and a lot of other kids very much do have these things help them get into college. And so if we're cutting an AP course, I understand, again, death by 1,000 cuts, but I just don't feel like we're in the position right now that we need to be making direct classroom instruction cuts. We very well might have to be, but what I saw when we first started was that there was going to be a tax decrease. Again, I understand this a lot, that the yield will still change, but I don't see, even in the sort of lesser good case scenario, that impacting direct instruction by cutting an AP class or a language course is a reasonable trade-off. I think the impact is greater than the $87,000 that it would change in the budget. I'm just speaking for myself.
I just want to be careful of our language though, because we're not suggesting cutting AP classes. I don't want that to be the headline. So what the World Language Department very thoughtfully presented to you today is the scenario of this is what it is now. and using what is now as a reality changes without having any conversation, I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, with what it could be if we had 0.8 less, right? It was just looking at just taking that 0.8 out. So if when talking, like, this wasn't a quick decision in any way, shape or form, but in talking with Jason and the administration at MHS, we can combine classes, we can do other things with scheduling. And so there are other ways to think about this as well. In terms, we wouldn't be presenting a position simply because of the attrition, right? Because if we got an attrition, if we had a math teacher resign, we'd have to hire another math teacher because of numbers, right? This is something that has low class sizes across the board, and is valued, absolutely 100%. And the administration here at MHS felt that we could do things a little bit differently. So it's just important to note, like, nobody's saying cut AP classes. I think it's just, we have to think about things differently.
Okay, thank you.
I'm wondering if it's reasonable to get sort of at the next meeting, a tweak of your thinking on that, because right now I'm not sure what that looks like, but it makes sense that there may be a option A and option B might not be our only, on this handout might not be the only options. And I wonder if it's possible, since this isn't the last meeting on the budget, if we can have a little bit of a sense of your thinking on what the language program might look like with 0.8 FTE.
I can talk to Jason about that. Scheduling at the high school is like, I don't know, well, I don't even know a good metaphor for scheduling at the high school. It is very, very messy. So to have a definitive, this is what it might look like without numbers of kids, without information you'd need to make that calculation, would be very hard to do. It's possible, but there is no definitive, like, this is what it would look like without that.
I'm not looking for a definitive. I guess I just think I've heard from, we've got the handout that was sent around today, and I think just hearing that there's sort of differences of opinion on the board, I think it might make sense that if we heard sort of more of an affirmative case for why it makes sense, then it might be something that would help everyone kind of land.
I think we could do the best we could.
And that's all.
Yeah.
Do we have another meeting on the budget?
We have a meeting that at the end of that meeting, you'll need to warn a budget. You'll need to approve the warning language.
Which would have the number in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we can take a peek at that. I think that makes sense. Keep that in mind.
I'm curious about why the classes don't fill up more. Is it a scheduling problem for the students to sign up because they have a low class size? So instead, why don't we fill the ones we have?
I think there's lots of different answers for that. But honestly, I think Jake's thought that I'd never even thought of before, that world language is split into 3 separate languages here, is a legitimate statement, right? When I'm talking to world language teachers this morning, we had a vacancy there, so we had to do Spanish 3 through VTVLC last year, 2 years ago, thanks, Colleen, which was not successful for many students. And so that would influence numbers for higher level Spanish last year and this year. We had COVID, which influenced just class sizes in general still for our upper level pieces. And they are electives. They're not They're not mandatory for our graduation requirements. So they are technically elective courses that kids do or do not have to take. So I think there's lots of reasons. Those would be 3 that pop into my head right now. But there are many reasons why. And I'd say 4th, we're a small high school, right? We are relatively a small high school. And so while we would like to offer our kids everything, that costs money to do so, right? And
if there's low enrollment, I'm not saying don't offer stuff. And I'm just thinking, maybe that is the place to think that is the program.
Yeah, Lynn, I'm glad you brought that up because I was gonna go back to what Jake had said about the class policy thing, which I learned too. I don't understand why language would be in the same, like department of like math or science regarding like the average size, considering that, you know, everyone is required to take an English, a math, a science, a history, but they're not required to take language. But the people who do take language are like split in three different ways. Some people double up, some people take multiple, but it is interesting because you're taking, let's say, a whole grade, 80 students roughly, who all take English in like 2, 3, 4 separate classes into 3 different languages. And not all of them take languages. And I think it's interesting because going back to what Libby was saying about COVID and the VTVLC work 2 years ago, going back to when I was in middle school, 7th grade was my COVID year and 8th grade was still COVID. We were in pods. And I think that really affected the years that came for students taking languages. Like plenty of people in my grade took languages, but not as many people. And I think more and more recently, people aren't as encouraged to take a language. And I think from my AP Spanish class, were we like 18, 20? We were a big class. Yeah, 18 or 19. And then this year it's much, much smaller. And I think that happens with COVID, with people having a falling out with a failed like online attempt and things like that. And I think that's really important to point out because with the potential to not have a Spanish 3, a second Spanish 3 class next year, that will mean that people are not able to continue taking that course, which will mean that they lose language skills and have to start again the next year, or they will no longer continue with that language because they weren't able to take it through MHF. I know that VTVLC courses are not cheap, and when the school can't pay for them, that is extremely hard for students who want to continue languages but have barriers that stop them from doing it.
So, well, next time, does that sound like a good?
I'm looking at Jason to see if it's possible because I don't want to speak for him on that since I don't do high school scheduling. He's get
Kind of map out some possibilities. Are there? Yeah.
Are you all set with me?
So any
Move on.
other questions? Sure.
Next time.
Next time, as you know, I really do think that this year is, I mean, every year has been helpful. I think this one's better than last year, but now, based on all of the signals that the state sends us. Like to try and set us up for success in the future by having more pushing and not. And also kind of replenish the capital fund because the little stories of the middle school second floor windows freak me out. So.
Yep, definitely.
Christina, I just want to make sure before we lose you, you're okay with that in terms of, because the warning is that we can do that as we go, correct?
Change it right here.
I just want to
Print it
make
out.
sure, I just want to make sure before we agree to that.
What is the date that we have to like, is it?
So we have a printing deadline is
Right.
what,
Okay.
and I think it's the 20,
You texted it to Jake today.
7.
well, yeah, it's around the 20.
Okay, that's fine.
Both towns, Montpelier and Roxbury have different deadlines.
Oh, we have a printing deadline of around January 22nd. The budget has to be warned. She just texted this to Jake today, so I'm reading Christina's words. The budget has to be warned 30 days before before the board's annual meeting. But the town clerks have given us the deadline of the 22nd.
Number 22nd.
Yes.
in 2 weeks from today.
Midnight on the 22nd, is there?
So Christina would email it out right after.
There's a lot of work to do on the 23rd.
We'd be a day late.
But that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, really, I don't want to create an impossibility here.
It's not impossible.
Okay.
We were planning on voting on the warning on the 22nd anyway.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Otherwise, we'd be voting on it tonight. Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We did say that we'd have a public comment period after
Oh,
that
yeah.
presentation. Anyone in the room or online have
Follow-
questions?
Or follow-up comments for us.
Comments, yeah. Yeah, Kelly?
I just want to, Colleen again, hi. I just want to address the point that I think Jim, you made about kind of if this happened in any department, this would be the piece of losing opportunities. And I just think there is a unique aspect to language classes in that they are sequential. And so you can't cut out a middle option and still provide the program. And we don't have multiple sections of classes. So it's not like we're looking at our 5 sections that we teach and combining them to make 4 larger sections. It's the most we have is 2 sections. And so that idea of combining Spanish 3 limits it to 1 section, and then you just can't fit that many students in that 1 section. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that's helpful.
You're fine, Bridget. This is what this is
I know,
for.
I know,
You're
but
fine.
Nerd out about this. I'm trying to just keep it simple. But I'd like to say, just to answer the question specifically about why are the class sizes this way? Nationwide, the attrition rate for language programs every year is about 50%. So that means if you want to have a senior class with 15 students in it, you would have to start with 120, right? So that's because 120, then 60 the next year, then 30, then 15. So obviously we're not starting with 120 students in our classes. And our retention rate is much, much higher than that. A testament, I think, to our students and their resilience and also to the success of our program. I think we have about 10 or 15% of our students who from one year to the next decide not to continue with the language. So naturally, we're going to have, if you start with a class of 24, if you do the math on that, you can't have a huge, if we had 1 section of French 2, that would significantly limit how many people would make it to French 5. Thank you.
No, thank you. All helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you.
And a second.
Yeah.
The one thing I would add, everyone, is that I think the attrition savings, we should decouple that from the class size policy. The class size policy, it has specific exemptions for new specialized and advanced classes. So I think reasonable people can disagree on how you would draw that average out, right? So for example, advanced might be AP Spanish. That I think a reasonable person reading the paragraph could come to the conclusion that that would have to be out of the rolling average. So I think there's a merit to the attrition argument. I understand the humanity behind that, but I think the class size policy argument is a separate thing that I think needs a little more careful reading of that specific paragraph at the end of it, which carves out those 3 exceptions. Thank you.
No, thanks. Other questions or comments?
Oh, we'll check out one side.
Let's check on one. Well, we were actually right on time. Thank you all for being here. It's rare that we are on time, although I thought there's a possibility I might be slightly early, but that never happens. Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have several members of the Washington County representatives in the legislature. And we just wanted to have a forum for us to discuss issues that impact the district. And obviously this is a very, I think, pretty fluid and critical time for that statewide as we're dealing with, declining student populations. Last year was a very tough budget year. This year appears to be a little better, but it's still not flush. And it's also, I don't think there's a lot of stability right now in some of the numbers. And we're probably looking at a few more years there and really, I think, wrestling statewide and district-wide with how do we provide just what we had, the discussion we had with the World Language Program, those type of enriching opportunities at our schools for students while we have declining school populations and a state that very much likes small districts and small schools and local control for a very, very good reason, but also, I think we have to be honest that that's an expensive model to upkeep and maintain. And there's just a lot swirling around, all of that, how we finance our schools, how we structure our districts. So wanted to have an open conversation. If you all want to come up to the table or pull up chairs.
I think it would be fun to have our legislatures in front of that mirror, in front of that microphone like I do. Yeah, exactly.
And thank you all for
Good idea. Yeah.
carving time for this discussion. And I know that you're,
For these gentlemen. Wouldn't share.
Thank you for coming.
yeah, thank you.
Coming. Welcome, crew. We got a powerhouse in front of us.
Yeah.
Jim.
Is there, no one's online?
No one's online. Kate McCann wrote that she apologized, but she couldn't be here tonight.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the issues I have in my mind and others might have several. We obviously do not want to end up in the mess we were last year. And I know that everybody on both on your side and our side put in a lot of extra hours to navigate that. I guess kind of top of mind, the things I'd really love to hear from you about is, one, just how you're feeling about this session, what might be coming up, whether there's any surprises. I'd love to hear just the discussion on kind of, my thought is we need some pretty significant changes. We talked about class size. I think some sort of mandatory class size policy statewide might be helpful. We have, soaring healthcare costs. I know that there's just only so much the state could do on healthcare costs, but we were relieved that the healthcare increases were only 12% this year. Exactly. That's just not sustainable. This district is at a place right now where when we hire a new teacher, kind of a first-year teacher, the cost of ensuring that teacher is about the same as the salary. That again, it's not sustainable. It's a huge piece of our budget. There has been some talk about a statewide teacher contract. The size of our schools and districts, I think there's a lot of advantages to small schools and small districts. It's a really expensive model. Getting people around the table to make those changes is very hard. I think thinking of ways to incentivize it without creating harm, or getting past some of the perceived harm, so people find ways to figure things out is big. There has been a 50-year discussion with our neighbors in Middlesex, East Montpelier, Berlin, Worcester, and Calais about merging our districts. It's really hard to move that forward, but this is a district where it really makes a lot of sense for that conversation to not only take place, but for something to occur. And I think, some of the issues we had tonight about, opportunities in world language would be an easier conversation in terms of preserving options and cutting costs if we didn't have two relatively small high schools 3 miles apart. And I think we have to start to wrestle with some of those realities. And then there's, I think, larger questions that play into this. Housing. It's really hard for starting families to enter into the housing market here. And it's also really hard for empty nesters and retirees to find downsized housing that will open up some of the 4 and 5 bedroom houses they're in, where a family that is kind of in the prime of their earning years and also the prime of their school going years can move into. So wrestling with that is a big thing. So just a few things.
No big.
Yeah.
Go ahead, react.
I can give you my reaction, which since both health insurance and property taxes are in the jurisdiction of the finance committee, and as of this morning, I'm relatively sure I'm going to be back there.
Congratulations,
I think,
I'm not.
yeah, my reaction is absolute terror. I'm on the commission on the future of education. I think the one thing we know is that there is no simple answer. There is no easy answer. We've had a discussion about the fact that it is really unfair to ask you to make decisions that are going to make some of your neighbors not talk to you. Some of us have experienced that, and it is not pleasant. You are here to represent the people in this school district. But we have an aging population. There is no downsizing housing, and so it's difficult for younger families to come in, even when there are jobs for them. We've made some changes, but I'm told that the cost to produce a house, a basic ranch 3-bedroom, is more than the average family can afford to buy. So we're going to have to find a way to invest. I've got some ideas, but there is no easy. I wish the federal government, since this is a national issue, would help us with a solution, but I'm not hopeful. We have a lot of small districts. We can't afford to pay a good wage to teachers and have them teaching 5, 6 kids in a class. This is a relatively larger school district. We've got one high school that has 24 students in the high school. Your only option right now is to cut classes, and we heard tonight that's painful. It means that some children are not going to get the classes they need or they want. I have a grandson who wants to be an astrophysicist. I'm not sure where he's getting that class, but I'm relatively sure that students graduating from here can probably accept their green and gold scholarship. We have other schools where students can't get the classes they need to meet the entrance requirements to UVM and aren't able, unless they find a way to take extra classes outside of their school curriculum, they can't accept a scholarship because they don't have the class base. We can't afford that as a state, as a country. Education is more important now than it's ever been. It's more complex, it's more extensive, and it's more expensive. And I don't think we can tax or cut our way out of this. I think we're going to have to find some money, and I really appreciate the effort you put into your budget, because we're going to have to get through this next tax year. And I don't think any of us want to go through last year. So we're gonna have to find some way to cushion that cost this year, but we're also gonna have to give people hope that we do have a plan going forward that will lower the base costs, not the quality, and will force many students increase the quality of their education. Montpelier, I sent 4 kids to this school. I have no problem. My son did because they didn't count grammar and spelling, and that did hurt him when he got to college, when they did count grammar and spelling. But those are fads that go through. He's learned, but they got a good education, and they got the classes they needed to go on and be successful. That might not be the same for every kid now, but we need to work together, because I've been told that I will have a 3-3 committee, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. And I will tell them, probably on Friday, if they get assigned, that we are either going to work to a nonpartisan solution, because this isn't a partisan issue, or they might as well all go home early and let me make the decisions. Because if it divides on a partisan level, that's what's going to happen. And that is not healthy for anyone, most especially the democratic process. So the pain is enough, I think, so that we are going to work together. We're going to have to work together to find a solution. And we're going to have the ability to run those solutions by you, to get your feedback as to what, if we do this, what will happen in the real world. And I just appreciate your opening these lines of communication, and hopefully we'll keep them going.
You got So thanks so much for having us today. I think I'm the lone House member, so I'll give you the sort of impression from the other side of the chamber 10 hours after we gavelled in, right? So I don't think you really have your thumb on the pulse of things yet, after 10 hours. But there was a sense today, you walked in and 18 of your colleagues who were with you before are gone, right? And they're gone for one reason. It's the mantra of affordability and property taxes being beaten from the governor's office and brought out to the campaign trail. So I can't really overstate the pressure that you feel when you go in that building, that your head's going to be on a pike if you don't do something pretty soon, right? Like you hear it from everybody. Sorry to, I'm just going to talk candidly with you. So I believe like we will see something, I'm glad Senator Cummings is in her seat. I'm glad you guys are in your seats. But like the storm's coming, right? And I listened to the nuances and the thoughtful deliberation you have at the local level here. And I think it's such a shame if we cede so much of that authority to the State House, who all of a sudden says, no, this is what's best for you, teachers contract this. I think it's going to happen to some extent. And what would be helpful for me anyways is sort of having a list of principles from the school board that guides us, as we're one of 150 in the House chamber, sitting on the corrections committee in my case, then we can go to leadership and say, okay, like these are the goalposts at least we want to be working in, right? But like, again, I'll state the obvious, we don't dictate how much is spent at the moment. We dictate who pays for it and how it's paid for. And I think you could see a shift in that as well, I wouldn't support a teacher's statewide contract. I think it's a beautiful thing. When I see Joe Carroll sitting across from the table from you, just neighbor to neighbor, working out some of these issues, which you've done very successfully over the last few years. So I think something's going to happen. Governor last year said, put it on the credit card, right? Put it on the credit card, tap the reserves, and we'll see what we can do. I've never been accused of being a fiscal conservative, but I don't think that's responsible either. So we got to do something. I don't know what that is yet, but any guidance from you would be helpful so that when we're under the dome there, we know what the best option for Montpelier is. And again, hopefully, to the degree possible, it's you guys making the decisions and not us telling you to merge schools like we have in the past, because I don't think it's always had the best results.
Can I throw out a couple right now?
Wait, hold on, let me get my pen, go.
And it would be helpful to have like a list that we could bring with us, seriously, if that's something that the board wants to work on.
Yeah, so I'll throw out a couple that combine my work here on the board and also what I do for the tax department. The timeline is way out of whack. What I mean by that is that the commissioner writes a letter on December 1st, and then we have to design a budget and warn it in late January. But beyond after late January, so many things change, and we can't change our budget. So that part is really deeply flawed. And this year and last year, but this year, things are going to move in a direction that we don't like, and we can't go back and revise our budget. So there needs to be a different timeline. That's one principle. Second principle is income sensitivity is hyper complicated. So we sometimes have people come here and make statements about how property tax credits work that are very misleading. It's not their fault. They're not trying to mislead. But it's just excruciatingly complicated. So that's 2/3 of all voters are getting income-based credit that they have no idea where it comes from. It's lagged a year. That part is also problematic. So if you want to maintain a system with local control, which it sounds like you do, there has to be a much better connection between budget and bill than there is now. It has to be a pretty clean walk from one to the other. And right now there's an obscuring factor for 2/3 of all voters that they can't understand. So they're going to make decisions that they may not be happy with. Those are two big principles that I hope get addressed this year.
Yeah, and to add to that, the disconnect between increases in district spending and how that hits tax rates. I mean, I know there's reasons for that, but it's really counterintuitive. I mean, we've had years where we've spent a lot and had very little tax increases, and then years like last year where we went through a lot of painful cuts and, had to ask like a 14-15% tax increase. So, that disconnect makes communicating really hard because people.
Then we aren't actually in control. And I don't need the control, but if local control means citizens determining what our budget is, then it actually doesn't, it's not working.
You just have control of the budget, but not the tax.
Right, but then they equate the two, but the two things are equated.
I think you have a perfect case study here. Our spending is going up almost $2 million to 7.7%. And it's spitting out a 3 to 6% tax increase. And as you saw tonight, the things that we have in our control, more capital plan or are tiny in comparison to a shift in the things that are on the state over the time period that we can react to. That's I actually think this is a really perfect picture of what's kind of so weird about this process and what needs fixing. Those numbers are so straightforward. It's my first time thinking about it, so I'm still finding out that's how.
You're not alone.
Yeah.
I would say that local control is important, but closing tiny schools via local control is extremely painful. And without something to blame or lean on, or it just hurts so much. And I don't want to be against local control, but when there's more direction because of rules that are designed to be fairly implemented across the state, then it just might lessen the blow a little bit.
I want to +1 that, because I do think consolidation of school districts is one of the answers. It's not the only one, as Senator Cummings, you were saying. This is a complex problem that's going to require many different pieces to solve it. And I think one of those pieces is consolidation of school districts. And in order to do that in a way that it feels like fair and sustainable across the state, I think there need to be more guidelines or rules that we need to follow in order to establish what a district looks like, so that we don't have like a district here and then a supervisory union there, and then a district that is part of a supervisory union. And there is a different way that neighboring towns determine, make decisions like whether or not to close a school or how to vote on a budget. That also is a factor in, I think, the complex, an unnecessary factor in the complexity, and makes the local control feel less, I don't know if fair is not quite the right word, but just like less there, really. And so that's one thing that's on my mind, is if we're to encourage smart consolidation, which I believe does need to happen, I think we need some framework from the state. And then in addition to that, one of the things that we've learned as still a fairly new, I mean, we're like 6 years old as a district, is that there needs to be some kind of support that speaks to the cultural piece of how districts come together, because it's not just the governance, and there's also human beings involved here with different points of view and different ways that they like to do things. And maybe, here in our district, we really value our world languages, as you saw tonight. But maybe if we were to consolidate with it or merge with another district that had less care for world languages, how do we decide then? Is it at the board level? Is it how to prioritize something like world languages? And how do you care for the transition of 42 young people from one school to another, which was a really big deal. And we had to figure it out on our own. And now what does Roxbury do with this fabulous building in their town? They're now having to figure that out on their own. And so that piece of how to consolidate, I think, needs to be thought through and given some support, so that we have districts who are moving toward consolidation rather than fighting it. Because I think we want to encourage it and not have to like mandate it. And I think that piece of it will help people feel more like, okay, maybe we can do this.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think we also have acknowledged the complexity and the fact there's going to be tough choices, like using our neighbors as an example. Worcester is never going to want to give up Doty. They're just not. Even though, if you look at the numbers, the combined total of Doty and Rumney are what Rumney was total a while ago. I mean, it's not serving that district well. It's not serving the kids well. It's not serving the education well to keep Doty open. And there's examples like that across the state. And that's an issue that is getting in the way of merger discussions between our districts. Just because it's an issue I think this town is not necessarily wanting to take on. And it's distracting, Wash Central. So, these things are tough. There do need to be guidelines, but there also needs to be tough decisions that are made, and maybe, some strong incentives to make them happen. Because we dealt with a tough closure last year. Probably educationally, it was the best decision. I mean, I'm just going to state that from an educational perspective, those students are almost certainly better off at UES than they were at Roxbury Village School. Not that the folks at Roxbury Village School weren't doing a great job and providing a great education, but there are just way more services for the educational demands at UES. And that's true, I think, throughout the state. But on a town by town basis, there's a lot of reasons that Worcester doesn't want to give up Doty. And I think we have to deal with those, but try to find ways that we can make the educational changes we need and then address some of the other problems, like making sure that the village of Roxbury continues to have a strong anchor and a strong community center, to make sure that Worcester continues to have a strong community center. And that maybe it's not going to be a school that does that, but not just create a vacancy, but also just not continue a model that's draining resources and not providing the education kids need.
I think that on Jim's point there, I hope that elected officials can courageously talk about how tiny schools may not be good for students. Nobody really wants to say it, but there's no research that indicates classes of 3 and 4 are good. In fact, there's lots of research that indicates what the ideal class sizes are. It's not 3 and 4. And when you have very limited programs, very limited personnel, and these kids in extremely limited groups, it's probably not doing a good job for them. It's not, they're not getting a good education. They need options. I think that honestly, I think that the people who believe that these tiny schools are a good situation are probably older members of a community who maybe went there as kids and they like the idea of having this local town center. And maybe it serves that purpose, but in terms of education, it's probably not the best. So they would be better off going 10 or 15 minutes down the road.
Yeah, no, and there are social costs to class sizes of 3 and 4 too. I mean, if you're the kid that's academically bent and you're with the 3 other kids are athletic and you're on the outs, that's hard. That's super hard.
And I think they would start to make that decision on their own if they had to pay for it. And this goes to I'd like your budget to bill terminology, because we don't have that, right? It's budget to, this crazy formula to what the tax bill is. And so there's tiny schools where the community is very supportive of that small school, but they're not paying the full cost of having a small school. And so it's just like, well, we can still have it and the state will kind of pay for it. Our taxes won't go up. So I think if there's a tighter connection there, it's like, okay, this is local control. Do you really want the small school? Then you got to pay the full freight of it. I also agree with the education point that the state should have some standards. Like, we're not doing them a favor by giving them local control if they're not educating the children. So we got to figure that out. But overall, I have the floor. I think the good news is, Jim, everything that you said in your opening statement are things that is being talked about at the State House. I think that was the list, the housing, healthcare, property tax. That is the pulse of the building going in there and what we're hearing. And it's different than last year. The December 1st letter last year was a shock and people said, we're definitely going to do something about it. But then we got to the end of the session and we were like, oh yeah, we were going to do something about it. Basically, we tried, but we couldn't get it done and then had a big fight about it. So I think that's very different this year. Like, I think communication between the legislature and the administration is better. Discussion is happening better. And I think it seems to me that we're going to have an answer, or at least a proposal, a lot earlier than we did last year. Last year was like, okay, we're going to figure it out. And we just kind of ran out of time before we figured it out. So I think I feel confident that we're going to do something. I think it's going to be difficult. People have different views on what's going to work. I think it's probably going to be some kind of foundation formula, because that gets a closer connection to what your budget is and to what you're charging your taxpayers. I think that's kind of where we're going to end up on that.
I guess I would just add that I feel like you all have started to answer the question that I had actually at the beginning of the meeting, which was, how do we help facilitate the consideration of consolidating schools? Like, what would make those conversations easier? And so I'm really appreciative of the suggestions around having a framework. I think that's a great word for it. And thinking about all the different considerations that would go into a process like that. And if there could be a roadmap for schools that that maybe don't want to go down that path because there's so many things to figure out. But if there are some guidelines or rules or a set of ideas, well, a set of supports, I suppose, to help people walk through that process. I think that would be, hopefully, would be helpful. And I'm also appreciating this idea of also perhaps combined with some incentives. But that's something that as we move forward, I mean, I'm going to want to continue to hear from you. The governor's going to have some suggestions about how we move forward. And I'm looking forward to having more conversation about all the ideas. One of the things that came up at the beginning of our caucus meeting, actually, in the Senate, was that all ideas for addressing education funding are on the table. And so as things come up, like we want to hear them. So please stay in touch as we move forward with all of this. So and that's also to say, like I'm hearing you about the things like the healthcare. I know that is on everyone's radar as well. I guess we kind of talked about that as well as housing. And so anyway, I'm very interested to see us move forward on all of these different funds, because I don't think it's going to be one solution.
Maybe I'm sort of changing the subject a titch, but I'll start by just echoing what we've been saying, right? So when we made that really heartbreaking decision, but really important and necessary decision last year to close Roxbury, one of the upsides I thought would happen is it would sort of allow other districts to feel that they had some cover, or at least they could sort of consider that it is a possibility. And then I saw, our surrounding district have that same conversation. There was no mathematical, educational, or pragmatic reason to not close those two small schools. And they didn't even take it to a vote because they realized it was like DOA. And I think that's just really a shame for those students. And I do think it set them and the sort of area back. And I don't know that any of their schools or districts have really started to have the conversation. I was really hoping that by us sort of putting ourselves out there and making that really tough call, that would help push that along. I was just going to say too, I think there's a lot of things that we vote on as a school board that we have no control over. I think there's a lot of things that you folks can't fix healthcare, you can't fix housing all on your own. But just to toss out this career and technical education, however, like I do think is something that we could do something about. I think it's a real missed opportunity if we don't. I'm really worried it's getting lost in all of the hullabaloo, because these are students, we're turning away a lot of really talented students who want to go, like Central Vermont Career Center. We turn around like 50% of the kids who apply. And these are electrical, auto, plumbing and heating. These are the people we literally need to stay in Vermont. EMTs, auto, like, I mean, I've had people complain they can't find people to do these things. So we have students who are, 17, 18, 19 years old who want to do that. They want to stay in Vermont. They want to do these things. These are good paying jobs and careers. And we're turning away 50% of them because we don't have the capacity for them. And funding CTE is sort of fighting for scraps with the school districts. Like it's sort of they're competing for those funds. So I don't have an answer. That's not very helpful to say, here's what I think we should do, but I don't know how to do it. But I do think it would be one of those pieces that could really have a long-term positive, like the investment in current technical education would pay off so much in the long run. Because I do think these are students that would stay in Vermont, pay their property taxes, have their kids come to the public schools and provide services that we really need. And if we don't do that, I'm worried about what will happen for them individually. And also I feel like we're kind of losing an opportunity. So that's all. Thank you.
I've got a really specific micro suggestion related to small schools and small towns. In the case of Roxbury, we, for this coming fiscal year, are going to pay the maintenance costs on it, which I can't remember how much they are.
60 to 70,000.
What is that?
60 to 70,000.
Yeah. So for our district, it's not a big expense. But if you add that to the town's costs, their municipal tax rate would skyrocket. And that's one of the reasons that they were really hesitant about taking the building back. And I think that for a lot of towns with small elementary schools, one reason maybe that they don't want their school closed is because they don't want to have that cost on the books. There needs to be help from the state for repurposing buildings when small schools do close. So it's not such a looming threat. It would have helped here. It's not available now, but hopefully in the future it is available.
Yeah, one idea I've heard from people on education is one of the kind of incentives is, yeah, you'll close your school, but we're going to build a new 21st century school for the whole district. And that could be something that is attractive enough. If we could come up with the money to do that, like not only deal with this issue, which I think is a good point, but then also say what's going to be the new build, because all these central high schools or central schools that we want to move people to are all old buildings, and we haven't had state support for paving construction for many years. So there's a lot of capital costs that have been deferred that we need to deal with as well.
And we know about those two? Yeah.
And I think another thing I've heard from folks in this discussion is what your point about you vote on a lot of things you can't have influence over. There's a lot of stuff in the education fund that school boards and the taxes based on that you guys aren't voting on. So there's no interest to do that. It doesn't solve the cost problem because we're just going to move it from the education fund to the general fund. So it's not fixing it. The taxpayers will pay it one way or the other. But I think there's real interest to make that clear as part of this effort to make it more clear. Like you get a vote on these things and your tax is going to be connected to those things you're voting on. If we're going to impose something on the education fund, then that should come from the state, not from the school board. And I think that would be a positive step if we could. I think it would be easy to figure out what those things are. It would be the difficult thing is how we're going to fund them through the general fund, because it's kind of easy to put them in the education fund because the tax just gets established and the bills go out. But you don't do that the same way with them.
But I mean, I was having a conversation with you the other day about.
I'm sorry.
Having a conversation with Billy the other day about the increased mental health burden of the students of children, and that seems to be pretty much what you're saying. There's been, I think, again, new at this, but there's been a shift of the service delivery model, even having the school take a much more front and center role, and that's shift from probably general funds to education fund. And I think it would be really helpful to have a much more deliberate articulation of that, what we want, what we think works, and is that the best model? If so, is this the best funding mechanism? Because I think those sort of quiet slides over from one to another without a pointer, we can get into trouble with. So as we're having that,
we have gotten into trouble.
Yeah. So I think just having that conversation a bit more spelled out, maybe than it's been in the past, and what do we want out of a mental health service delivery model then?
Yeah, I think mental health, universal school meals. I've spent the summer telling the commission, who's on future of public education, that we haven't gotten the revenue forecast yet. We will get that, I don't know, next week, maybe. With the economist, that's the revenue forecast we have to build our budget on. But seeing the revenue as they're coming in, there's not going to be a whole lot of money in the general fund to take over the cost of mental health, school. You might as well say that universal school meals will be dead because I don't see the money being there to pick it up. Mental health is an issue. It started when we closed the state hospital many years ago. And the idea was that services could be better rendered and more humanely rendered and cheaply rendered. I think over time, we have just habitually underfunded that system. Last year, it came in with zero increase in the governor's budget, and my committee made some increases in some fees that we weren't really happy with, but we thought the mental health system should get at least a 3% increase in their funding. It's always those community-based services, home health, mental health, have always been the place where you get down to the last night in the budget and you need a couple $1 million. And that's where it comes from. Doesn't have a loud enough constituency. So we have an underfunded system. They're having the same problems all the rest of you are. They've told us for years. Their workers go to the schools or the state and they make $2,000 to $5,000 more the day they walk in the door. We have that problem. We also have the problem that the student mental health behavioral needs are at a level. I've checked with my kids. They were here in the 90s. But starting probably in the teens, seems to kind of go hand in hand with the advent of social media. There's been a fair amount of discussion about that impact, but there definitely is a more acute need. There's always been students that have mental health issues, but not in this kind of broad numbers and broad, just numbers of kids that need help. And we are going to have to deal seriously with that. We've talked about school construction. You could take Roxbury in. I've got another district that has, I believe, 4 or 5 elementary schools. They don't have a school that would hold all of those students. And the schools we've got are all built in the 70s. They're all deteriorating from before the 70s. Some of them are ancient, as in this town. And I've asked, where am I getting the money to put on the table as an incentive? Because I don't know where it's coming from. I keep being told school construction and bonding. But I know that the state is going to have to come up with help for the towns. We're going to have to build the schools to put your extensions on the schools if we want them larger to put kids in. And they are going to have to be nice, shiny new schools. And we're going to have to repair the ones that we aren't putting together. And where that money's going to come from, I don't know. Andrew will find it.
Pick back up, Tim, we throw around the term community schools quite a bit, right? And I think that means different things to different people. And one thing we can do better on the state is really define what that is and what we expect schools to be doing. Because if you talk about of course costs are going up. We're doing a lot more than we did 20, 30 years ago, right? So we need to be clear of what we expect the school to do and who's going to pay for the different buckets there. So having that clarity, I think, is the first step, because we're all on that right now. But we know that during those hours the kids are at school, it might be the only time they get a hot meal or those conversations they need to have or the healthcare they need. So we got to do it. It's just a question of how we do it, right?
Yeah, and I think schools are in a tough position where a lot of the services that have been cut or have eroded over the years, they show up in schools in a way that you can't ignore. The behavioral problems spill over, the kids who aren't getting proper nutrition at home, and they're at a point where you can't say sorry, we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, we're not allowed to.
Yeah.
Or the kids can't learn.
Yeah.
Which is what they're going to do.
Just on a point on the statewide contract. When I think of that, I think of the statewide health insurance contract, which I don't know if you guys consider that a success or not.
Don't use the same bargaining rules.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's just another example of there's no kind of easy fix. We thought the governor was like, yeah, this is going to help us save money, and health costs have gone up a lot, and teachers have good health insurance, which I support, but I don't. Changing the formula or the way we do these contracts is not likely going to save us the money that we might think of.
I don't think that's a money issue. I think it's an equity issue. So, my colleagues in Franklin Northeast or Mrs. Skoy, that I know, Senator Cummings has some connections to. They train them for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then they go to even St. Albans down the street and make $20,000 more with a healthcare membership. Like it's just really hard to give up. And we don't see that kind of turnover here at MRPS in any way, shape, or form. And we're not the highest paying district in central Vermont either. But we're a great district to work for, right? And we have great kids and great families and great support. I think that's more of an equity piece that Franklin Northeast will never have. They're the lowest per pupil or spending district in the state. There's 3 people behind them and they don't have schools. Like that's how ridiculous that is. And they'll never be able to attract the teachers they need to support their kids on their contract when they can make $25,000 more in St. Albans or Fairfax. So I think that piece for me is part of this very complicated puzzle, but it has a different rating for, like, I care about kids. I care that my kids here at this district and my kids at home, but I also care about the kids up in Swan, so how do we ensure that's the equity piece that I know the commission is wrangling with quite a bit. And it won't be cheaper. It will be more expensive because the teachers in South Burlington are not going to say, yeah, pay me less. So I know it'll be more expensive.
Yeah, I think we can't lose sight of the equity, and my goal would be to do that through the pupil weighting, through categorical aid, and through some kind of foundational payment. Maybe it's not the same wage across the whole state because costs are different, but maybe it's, well, here's a minimum, or here's what the state will help that school with, but then the rest of it and up to the district. Because I know you and I have talked about this, the policy of superintendents sometimes not letting a teacher move that could go to work at the district to make more money, and they're kind of stuck in that district even though they don't want to be. So the state in a way is kind of helping those districts by making it a little more difficult for some of that movement, but that's probably a small impact. But
yeah, and another thing, one of my colleagues, back to the education finance, I can't remember which colleague said this to me a couple of weeks ago, but like if there's something about a cap, like you can only spend so much money, right? Shouldn't there also be a cap of you can only spend so low, like yeah, exactly. You have to spend at least this much. So it can't be a local decision to underfund their schools, which is happening for a neighbor down the street. Yeah.
Amount somewhere in the formula. That you can't go below. I think it's in your tax rate, but it's obviously not effective. The challenge, there's a lot of interest to go into the foundation plan, but there's 2 challenges. One is when we did it, we didn't fund it. We have always protected schools from the economic ups and downs. And I know during the last recession, when we were hatcheting every place in state government and the schools got a formulaic increase, there was some unhappiness. Going to the income tax may make you more vulnerable, but I think we also realize you can't just eliminate teachers and things during the school year. But we have to deal with we guarantee, because there was a formula, because nobody trusted the state to put the state share of funds into this new, and the towns were giving up the property tax. So we have to have a way to ensure so that people feel comfortable that foundation formula will come in every year and that we won't just monkey with it I don't know why people think we might monkey with things, but we have to have that surety. And the other one is Brigham.
Yeah.
If we could just do a formula and say you're on your own, then we're right back to the towns with huge tax bases can go back to having violin orchestras in their middle school and other schools can't afford music and never, so it's the Brigham conformity. We did Act 60 to maintain local control as we'd have it, local budgets, local voters, that's what you spend. And to meet Brigham. So you got the formula to equalize it. But the connection between your budget and what you spend has become too large.
And it's not equal.
And and so we're going to be redoing it. I would not be surprised to see us come out with a some form of foundation. How we're going to fund it, the devil is always in the details. And we will probably be hashing out those details until July. We have to have a budget set by July or everything sets down. And it's going to have to be agreeable to everybody. So it will be a challenge.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking of the timeline, I just want to come back to your suggestion, Jake, about the timing of everything. And I am appreciating the difficulty of the time, that exists right now. And we can talk about this later, but if you have any suggestions around what you think might be a better set of timing for the process, I'm very interested.
Yeah, no, I do. And I think it could be really consistent with a foundation formula. Like if you know like years in advance how much you're going to get per kid, and then in December from AOE how many kids you have, then that part of your budget is set. And if you knew what the penalty or what the implications were for spending beyond that amount, then you could do quite a bit of planning ahead of time. And you wouldn't be waiting for a yield or 2 yields. And so I think there's potential there.
Great. Okay.
We're waiting for your budgets to set the yield.
Right.
So in last year, we couldn't set the yield because we didn't have enough budgets. So it's complicated on both sides. They don't do the December 1st letter until they see what superintendents are released saying they're going to be recommending for increases.
Before we even put pen to paper.
Yes. So it doesn't work for anybody the way it's set up.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some funny stuff play out this year. The yields in the letter were very favorable, as long as you're not spending beyond the excess spending threshold, which is brought back and it's really punitive. But for us, it's pretty favorable. But there's this chicken, egg situation in Vermont. And so like they see these favorable yields and they're like, oh, we have a little capacity here. And they decide to spend more. And then they don't know about a new yield until after their budget's warned. So the chicken egg thing is not working, and then things keep playing out and then nothing is even set until May. So it's really, really off.
We've been talking for some good this year.
Oh, yeah. I'll let Jake correct me on this one, but I'm lucky to have this expertise on my board, right? One thing that could be an immediate help for this year's budget is to ask the agency to collect where we are now. Most of us are in the stage where you all saw tonight, where we're pretty close to what our ed spending is. And many of us are different than what we projected to Jake and his colleagues at the tax department. And so if they get those numbers earlier, they can work them, they can use them better, faster. But they can't do anything with the yield until they know what we're doing. So, but it's my understanding the agency has to ask us to get, to collect that data. And it's a very simple data collection. It's just how much is your ed spending increased, right? Pretty much, it's a percentage. So it's a very easy number that every business manager in the state currently has, with the exception of maybe Essex Westford, who votes later in the timeline.
And that would still be helpful, you think, even though the budgets are not themselves warned or set or.
Because it can give the tax department an idea.
Right.
Of,
They had November.
Yeah.
right, a better set of numbers, yeah.
That makes sense.
That would make our discussion on what we want to do with the FTE capital plan instead of this wide range of a 3% increase with a 10% increase. We can maybe cut that in half. That would be awesome.
The window.
Decide.
Yes. I will ask. I will ask. Issue also depends. I will say I've gotten more data out of the tax department in the last the education department in the last 6 months than I have in the last 6 years. I mean, they have been cracking the data out. I don't know if they've collected this one, but if all it takes is an email to the business managers to say, what's it look like? I mean, is your school board
Yeah, that's
saying, yeah, this
literally
is
all it
good, or
takes.
is your school board saying, no way, we're cutting this, but we could get a much better idea as to, in general, where the budgets are going. Nothing is set until the taxpayers speak.
Yeah, to Secretary Saunders and Deputy Secretary Jill Briggs Campbell's credit, they are most definitely, they saw the hole in the data need, and they are most definitely trying to fix that.
Yeah.
And that is obvious to everybody in the field.
I realize that we've kept you here a lot longer than we promised you, but one of the things that we have sort of touched on tonight, but not really gotten into, is the question of housing and increasing or encouraging housing, because we talk about Vermont as an aging state and declining student population, but it doesn't that doesn't have to be our future. And we are a place where people do want to live and are going to want to live as our climate gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and it's harder to live in other places. And so and not that this is like the magic wand that's going to save everything, but when you have more students and you have more taxpayers to fund but you don't have to, when you can like fill in some gaps with students and with taxpayers, it seems like housing is one of those things that can really be a big factor in the affordability piece. So I'm curious to know what you all could be doing at the legislative level to encourage more housing here in the state.
Yeah, and before you answer that, I think, housing is also really important to attracting good teachers.
Or anything. It needs to be a comprehensive approach, like that into the legislation, to look at these state land and state buildings that are being underutilized in the Montpelier area, specifically here. You look at a lot of empty parking lots still in town here, and that's not only having a impact on the lack of housing here, but on our downtown merchants and everything by having a lot of telecommuting. And at this point, I think we can safely say state employees are not coming back to the capacity that they were before. So we need to think about the uses of those buildings. That's one thing submitted there.
I think this is one of the frustrating issues. It's counter to the market theory. The demand is there and the market is not responding. And from what I've been told, it's not responding because it can't. The infrastructure costs are almost, the same amount, getting water and sewer into buildings, just the basic infrastructure raises that price to the point where you can't make a profit and do a $250,000, $300,000 house. I'm having a bill drafted, and it will be controversial because it could impact the ed fund, but would probably have to do away with the economic development TIF and do a housing TIF, which would allow the towns to bond and use the tax money from the new houses, that they could use that money to put the infrastructure in and then pay their bond off with that money. I know Montpelier has talked about going out for a bond to put the infrastructure up to the country club, but that seems to be, we don't have a lot of town-owned developable land that we can contribute. That's the one thing I've thought of that could help get the base cost of housing down so that seniors could downsize. And young families could move out of the apartments that we're building and move into single family homes, which a lot of people don't want to raise children in high rises. We've demonstrated in the past that that isn't always the best place to raise children for any number of reasons, but I'm open to any suggestions, but we do have to get that cost down. I mean, just the base cost is, if it costs you $300,000 to put in the infrastructure, you're building a $500,000 home or more. And that's above what your first year students, what all those, recovering tuitions to say, well, if you work or stay in Vermont for 2 years for nurses, teachers, that's fine. But if they can't afford to settle here, then we've just wasted a lot of money, and we need to find a way to make it possible for them to stay here. This is a good place to settle and to raise a family. And we need those kids. My street used to have 67 kids and its own school bus. I don't think there's 10 kids on it. And therein is the base of the problem.
I think that Act 50 used to be sort of the scapegoat for why there was not more housing, and we passed I think some great legislation last year that created some interim exemptions as we sort of rethink about how Act 50 is applied. And so it would create exemptions for places where there is water and sewer available. And so that's a lot of Montpelier. But I want to highlight the factor that Senator Cummings was raising about the cost for infrastructure, that for so many of the places that have potential, they need that interconnection. And my understanding is that there are some pots of money that municipalities could access, but there are restrictions on that don't allow them to be used for infrastructure. So I'm interested in seeing if we can create more flexibility for municipalities in spending that money to hopefully make those projects pencil out. I mean, that's at least one of the big barriers, but I also see it as money just in general. Yeah.
And I think the bill passed. Early reports is that it is working.
Yes,
They are getting
yeah.
more housing. It's going to take a long time to get out of the hole we did.
Get better next year.
Yeah.
Not fast enough.
We're heading in the right direction, but not fast.
Yeah.
Cost certainly is a big part of it. And I think another part of it is, and I don't mean to make Act 250 a scapegoat, but it has created a culture of, no, we want these beautiful rolling vistas instead of density, where density actually could be very beneficial to us. And so I think there does need to be an attitude shift and a little bit of a okay, maybe we have some things we have to give up, which is I don't live on 5 acres of my own land anymore. I have neighbors that are a lot closer to me than they used to be. And that is more of a mindset shift and an approach shift and I don't know if there's there's things that you could do at the legislature, but there is.
Well, go ahead. I'm glad you said that, putting on my day hat. There's a lot of property tax exemptions, but there's also a really steep penalty right now for removing smaller parcels from current use. That is, I think it was well intentioned, but also I think the policy priorities are a little different now, and it's really causing a lot of hardship for people who can't afford it. So it sort of disincentivizes taking smaller pieces out because they're valued as a standalone parcel, and then the tax is based on that. So if you're pulling out 2 acres, but you're going to leave the rest in, it's actually very expensive to take that little 2 acre part out right now. It's a pretty high penalty. Yeah, right. So that's a place where it's if we're rethinking that we want to sort of concentrate development, and then we can still leave the vast majority looking all right. That's another one that just in my day job, I see that a lot too.
Well, and I want to add to that too. It's one of the things that we are continuing to think about is the role of appeals, because in an ideal world, right, the appeal should not be a weapon, and so that so much of that is on the a different branch of government, right? And so we've got to, be a little careful there, but because we can't tell them what to do, but it's also like, we can fund them properly. Because if those appeals were fast, then it would not be weapons. So that's one of the goals that I have anyways. How can we fund the judiciary sufficiently so that any appeals get cranked through so that it's not death by delay?
For me, particularly on aesthetics, like this, it's not an environmental problem. And if people are complaining about some aesthetic issue, that to allow them to tie it up, and it's an equity issue because it's usually people that have the money, the lawyers that tie it up and kill the project. In the state, when we have declared things public goods, then they get built, because they kind of have a much easier permitting process. We haven't done that for housing or for shelters. So we could do something like this is a public good, so therefore it gets basically expedited permitting. I wouldn't want to do it for condos and Stowe, but I think you could do it for shelters, things that are really hard to permit, but are really a public good. Tim knows from our experience on energy, we have built a lot of big energy projects, so megawatts of solar that a lot of people didn't like, but they all got permitted, or most of them got permitted. Because we've declared this energy infrastructure a public good, and the permitting structure for those energy projects are drastically different, or very different than Act 250 for a housing block.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the time and you staying over hour. Yeah, and obviously to be continued, a lot to work on, and really glad to have your partnership and representation in the State House. And yeah, let's keep the lines of communication open. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for all your hard work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
But don't hesitate to call, email. And you can say, have you thought of, or what are you thinking? It's helpful.
I think we're motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, everyone.